once again, thank you for your patience, everyone. My name is Jodi Rudoren. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward, and I'm thrilled to be here hosting, moderating a really interesting panel discussion that was put together by BINA, the Israeli Jewish social justice organization. Just to let you know, a little bit of tachlis before we start. We've got 4 panelists today. I'm going to give brief introductions in a sec and then just jump right into the conversation. You've already gotten yourselves acquainted with the chat function, and the chat function is best used for a comment that you'd like to make for the whole group to hear. This is not where we want you to pose questions to the panelists, and the reason is that it flows by very fast and I can lose track of it. But if you have just a comment to make or maybe a link that you'd like to share with the group, you're welcome to use the chat function. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to one of the panelists, please use the Q&A button that should be in a similar place on your screen, either on the bottom if you're on a computer or on the left. And I will be looking at those questions and posing those questions to the panelists on your behalf. Otherwise, you should stay muted throughout the seminar so that it doesn't distract. As you know, when with Zoom, anybody who makes any noises, the focus gets to them. So we are gonna jump right in just a second. I think that is all by the way of tachlis. So I'm gonna start with, as I said, just a quick introduction of our great panel today. And it's very international in scope. We have Nir Braudo, I think that's how you pronounce it. He's calling in from the secular yeshiva at Tel Aviv. He is the deputy director of our host organization, BINA, which is all about rooting social action, social justice work in Torah and tradition. And he is going to start us off in just a few minutes with a little Devar Torah to set the table for our conversation. And then we have Ruth Messinger from calling in from New York. I will forever think of Ruth as Manhattan Borough president, although she's actually spent much longer running the American Jewish World Service, where she now is the global ambassador. This is, and she's also a social justice consultant, and she's been involved in so many Jewish movements and organizations that she has a very great overview to share with us. And then we have Daniel Posen, who is in Switzerland. He's the co-founder and CEO of the Posen Foundation, which does amazing work supporting education initiatives in Israel, among other things. And Daniel spent most of this pandemic in Colombia, which he'll be telling us about soon. And then
you can take it out now, but I'm going to put it back at some point. You can turn it off and take it out.
I think Terry Newman is also in Tel Aviv, if I'm correct. He'll correct me if I'm wrong. And he runs global construction companies that have been at the forefront of disaster relief, peacekeeping, and healthcare. Has a really interesting perspective from that point of view on the pandemic, and also from a philanthropic or social entrepreneurial point of view, which he will share with us. So as I said, we're going to start with Nir. He's going to teach us a little bit and set the table for us. I would love to hear, Nir, I think you're going to tell us about the origin of the phrase that you chose as the title for this webinar, "The Poor of Your Town Come First," and give us some framing from Torah, from text, for this conversation about how to balance social justice, social action work within and outside the Jewish community.
Sure. Thank you, Jodi, and the Forward for being a co-host with us to this event. And good evening, everyone from Tel Aviv. Here at night time, evening time, in summer evening time in Tel Aviv. And I'm talking to you from the BINA Center in South Tel Aviv, the secular yeshiva in South Tel Aviv, which is one of BINA's homes, BINA network of yeshivas here in Israel and a few other spots around the world. So, as you said, this is coming from the Bible, from Exodus. If you lend money to any of my people, even to the poor person who is with you. This is from Exodus. And as you know, the people from the Talmud, they like to interpret the words of the Bible, and they are asking us, who is with you? Why does the pasuk in Exodus says, "Who is with you?" Or in Hebrew, "Ani imcha." And they say, if your poor person, meaning one of your relatives, and one of the poor of your city come to borrow money, your poor person take precedence. If it is between one of the poor of your city and one of the poor of another city, the one of the poor of your city comes first. So these famous discussions, this is from the Talmud, and this famous discussion comes in the context of prohibited interest-bearing loans. This is like many Jewish discussions on justice of property. Many of the phrases we interpret today as charity or tzedakah originally discussed the giving of loans with favorable terms, where the lender will not benefit much, but the borrower can use the funds to rebuild their life. I believe we are witnessing a deep and old understanding of financial rebuilding. Charity creates dependence on the giver. A fair loan allows the recipient to be independent and contribute to the community. This is also very relevant to the current financial hardship we are going through today. Of course, the main discussion is one of priorities. Not everyone can receive those loans because that will lead to a collapse of those individuals, organizations who still have the financial means as well. So how do you prioritize? This is the basic question of social justice. The proposition here suggests we should prioritize according to the closeness. But what kind of closeness it is? Tribal, Jewish comes first, or geographic, your city, your neighborhood? Throughout Jewish history, social organizing has been mostly one of community. Sometimes communities such as a Hasidic court was spread as so wide that you could have neighbors in need who are not a part of your community, as opposed to members of the community who are far away. And it's creating an halachic discussion, a long halachic discussion of this phrase. So the question is, what does we say about it? For modern day Jews who mostly live in developed countries, what is our obligation? Towards whom? Our people, our community, our non-Jewish neighbors? At BINA, we believe strongly in the power of education, tikkun olam. And we also know that education alone is not enough to bring about the change we wish to see in the world. Therefore, BINA combines education with providing skills and opportunities for hands-on and social action. Every year, BINA's Tel Aviv Secular Yeshiva campus is located in the undeveloped neighborhoods of South Tel Aviv, which are populated by people with a lower socio-economic status, be it Jews, refugees, or asylum seekers, non-Jewish migrant workers, and each day we deal with these questions in practice as an integral part of our daily work. And that's why we find it very relevant to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nir. I really appreciate it. And I understand that actually I don't think we have a Q&A button on this Zoom, or I don't see one, and people are telling me they don't have one. So I'm going to change my direction on that, which is actually to hold your questions for a bit. And as we get into it, I'll call for questions later so that they can be consolidated. Ruth, I want to turn to you next to continue to sort of talk a little bit about how you've come at this question, this tension between helping your own community and looking outward. It's I think a perennial, as Nir just talked about, a perennial dilemma. I know my own rabbi, Mark Katz, talked about this universalism versus particularism as part of one of his high holiday sermons last year, but it has seemed particularly pertinent in the pandemic. This is a thing that has really afflicted kind of every community, although not all in the same way. And I think some of the New York Jewish philanthropic and community service organizations really felt this dilemma in March and April, really had pointed discussions about how much money and effort might be redirected towards COVID. Should it be towards Jews and COVID? Should it be towards COVID more broadly? Should it be towards COVID in underrepresented communities or that were hit particularly hard? And I wonder, Ruth, what you saw in the organizations you're involved with and how you kind of parried that question.
Okay, Jodi, you'll interrupt me if I'm going on too long, but I want to say, first of all, I think it's a perennial and powerful debate. Nir hit on some of it. You know, the Talmud that he was quoting from is complicated. Your own town comes before another town, but Jews come before non-Jews, but this, but that, and you try to put all these binaries together and you realize that they're fascinating teachings, but they don't actually cover an existing situation. Just as you describe, if the people next to you are dealing with abject hunger or they've been evicted from their home, how many of these tests do you apply before you decide to help them? I'd also like to offer one commentary, not specific to the text that Nir was talking about, but one of my favorite observations comes from Rabbi Joachim Prinz. Rabbi Prinz was originally the chief rabbi in Germany, escaped, was in New Jersey where he was a congregational rabbi. He's most famous for giving a speech that nobody remembers because he gave a speech right before Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. He was the chosen rabbi. But in that speech that nobody remembers, he said, which is the important point here, neighbor is not a geographic concept, it's a moral concept. So the whole question about how you define neighbor, and particularly how you define neighbor in a world in which we all say all the time, oh, because of this, because of social media, because of airplanes, because of whatever, it's a very small world. Well, if it's a very small world, then we have to think about what does neighbor mean? What does help mean, and how do we combine these? So that's one point. The second point I want to mention, which really goes to the particular and universal, that's a great sermon. I'm sure your rabbi gave it. I'm sure everyone's rabbi has given it. But you know, in our lives, folks, we actually are able to do both. You know, you can walk and chew gum at the same time, to quote a former American elected official. And so we do some of these things that are directly to our most immediate community, our most immediate sense of our circle of obligation. And then we look at where is need. And where is need that, frankly, nobody is going to meet if we don't need it. For example, if there is a massive hurricane, as there is almost every year in a Central American country like Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala, what is the responsibility of the American Jewish community? Are there Jews in those countries? Yes. Are they very significant part of the population? No. Might they be in distress from the hurricane? Of course. But are we really going to go in as the American Jewish community and just help the Jews of Honduras cope with the devastation from the hurricane and not help the hundreds of thousands of people who are suddenly homeless? I think not. I think what we're talking about balancing is, you know, who is the other and the stranger who need our help, and who are we? And this does require, Jodi, I'll get to the COVID in a minute, but this does require also all of us grappling with our comparative levels of privilege. Are we a community with problems? Of course. Are there poor Jews? Absolutely. Are there still threats, and sometimes new threats of anti-Semitism? Yes. But can you function in America and not look at the people whose problems are infinitely more severe and be a good Jew? I don't think so. So that's the premise of American Jewish World Service. And so I just wanted, I'm happy to come back to COVID in a minute, but at least for me, having done this with American Jewish World Service for 20 years, COVID is nothing new. COVID raises the same problems that almost every single issue raises, and that is, how do we balance help in our immediate and own community with help to people who need it the most? And I just want to say about COVID, although COVID presents severe and growing problems in the global south, in the 19 countries where AJWS works, before we go there, I think the American Jewish community has to answer the question, what are we going to do about the clear evidence that our health systems have led to infinitely less adequate health services in communities of color, and that is why COVID is hitting those communities so hard. Did we cause that problem? Maybe, maybe not. But as Rabbi Heschel says, whether or not we are guilty, we are responsible.
Thank you, Ruth. I will come back to you to press you a little bit more on COVID. I want to turn to Daniel now. I want to ask you to pick up, I want to remind everyone to please mute yourselves, or if the official host of the Zoom can mute everybody, that'd be great. Except for Daniel. I want Daniel, Ruth just said something about the word neighbor and how it kind of depends how you think about the word neighbor. And you found yourself in March, not at home, but in Colombia, and ended up spending, I think, 5 months there, returning to Switzerland just last week, if I'm correct. And I would love for you to tell us just the story, the narrative of kind of how that happened and how that perhaps changed and informed all the things that you did while there related to COVID, you and your foundation, and how it maybe changed and informed your perspective on this question of who your neighbor is and what it means to help your town first.
Okay, well, thank you and good evening, and thank you to BINA and to Jodi and Forward. Remind you, Jodi, never to put me after Ruth, who speaks so well in English, and I will hang up after you do it the next time, because she speaks so well. I can only ditto what she says because she speaks so nicely. And I would just say that, Colombia I used to live in Peru, and I know South America very well, and I do live part of my life there, so it wasn't like I was stuck. But I think the great equalizer besides death is a pandemic like this, because we're all in some ways in the same boat, in some ways. And I think the privilege part of what Ruth said is very important. I find it somewhat abhorrent to me personally, maybe because of my background where I don't really come from any particular place, growing up in Japan and living in England and in Russia, Peru, and these kind of places, that for me, it is the neighborhood, it is the moral concept, as I think Ruth said. It is helping the other, and the other is whoever the other is in your neighborhood. I don't think we look at color. I certainly don't like to look at religion. These people have the same needs, wants, and hopes, and the same blood color. And I really think this was that proof, Jodi, that we have an island near us with a little under 20,000 people that all live from tourism. And in one fell swoop, they lost their jobs, naturally, nobody to blame. And I think that almost makes it harder when you don't have anybody to blame. And they had no food. I mean, it was one of those perfect storms of nobody has money. Money had no value on this island because money doesn't buy anything. And we were delivering food with other foundations to 18,000 people every week since March 19th or 20th. Eggs travel with a military escort. I mean, just to give you some crazy idea, because egg is what people kill for. Cash, not really, because you can't buy anything anyway because the stores are empty. So it was I consider myself somebody with quite a bit of worldwide experience, nothing like this. And therefore, this was, in a way, the great equalizer. And I think my wife and I and a number of others got together with some big foundations, and we simply made it happen, which is, of course, money, but more than that, organization. And we didn't think of who we were feeding. It doesn't matter. And I think it's a terrible idea to think in these moments to help only a certain kind of people, black, white, yellow, green, purple, Jew, non-Jew. It would not have occurred to me. Now, clearly, those who live in Jewish neighborhoods, whether it's New Rochelle or Muncie or whatever, I understand you have a different perspective to an extent because your neighbors may be different than mine. We help in Israel also what the people from BINA said about helping the people of the neighborhood. We help the South Sudanese and the others that live there because they're our neighbors, for God's sake. And I think there's a pretentious angle to the idea that you help one kind of person, and I'm very much against it. I do a lot for Jews because I believe in our culture, and most of what I do is with Jews, so it sounds like a bit of a contradictory statement, but this is an education and so on. But the moment that you have a pandemic of this nature where we all have a common denominator, I really don't think that's an appropriate thing to discuss. I think we need to talk about the moral concept of our neighbors and get on with it and stop talking about it. And that's kind of what we've been trying to do. It sounds like what I said was easy. It's been very difficult and a huge challenge. Stop me when I'm going overboard, Jodi.
No, you're doing great. you want to talk a little bit more about the logistics and how challenging it was to just get the eggs to the island?
Well, we do what the WHO and others, UN agencies allow, which is a little bit more than the minimum for a family of 5, because that's important that we deliver balanced food and also hygiene equipment and so on. Military, we have military escort, we have police escort, private security with guns, because food is worth killing for, and people haven't, because they've been fed. And I think I've never dealt really with food in this way. This has not been my area. But wow, have I learned something at my 62 years of age, that, you know, you give people enough food and they can worry about other things, family violence, which is huge, all this stuff, family violence of all kinds, education, everything stems from what I've learned over these weeks, is that if you have the ability to feed, and people know that they will be fed. And most importantly, I will say the Jewish side is the second highest level of giving, which is people don't know who's giving. Very important. South Americans don't understand that, because it's all about, you know, what I've done for you. So when they looked at me like I came from some odd planet, the idea is, please don't say, because it's not important who we are. Our customers, who are the ones being fed, are the ones to focus on. And then they get on with their lives, because you don't really want to be involved in their lives. You just want them to be able to sustain themselves. So it was an emotional roller coaster, but I wouldn't have done anything else if I had to do it again.
Thank you, Daniel. And I'm sure everyone sees Pat's really interesting comment in the chat, which really resonates with me, about how do you distinguish sometimes what's right in front of you is the most available thing to help. And sometimes, as in Daniel's case, that might be people who are particularly desperate, but other times not. I've been a couple of times a week throughout the pandemic volunteering at a food pantry out here in Bloomfield, New Jersey. And most of its clients, the clients are really in need. I'm going to post an article I wrote about it in the chat in a minute. The clients are certainly in need, but they are not starving. They are people who I think shop for groceries and very much appreciate having this to supplement what they can buy. We, for most of the pandemic, have had amazing produce to offer, and I think that is probably something that was very special for these families, but they are not the most in need. And you know, there are people more in need only a few miles away from me in much more difficult neighborhoods, but this is more accessible to me to help. And it is an interesting the sort of ladder of need and how you maybe cope with that, particularly with the restrictions around COVID, can be challenging. I am going to turn to Terry now, and I think Terry has a really interesting perspective on this from the last few months. You'll hear, it's so great having the different accents we have on this panel, but Terry's been in Israel for many, many years, and when we talked earlier, he talked about how the general relationship between American Jews, American Jewish organizations in Israel is largely a one-way street, is largely American Jews supporting and donating to Israel. He made an analogy to parents and children, but that in the last couple of months, he was part of an effort that sort of reversed that trajectory when, especially early in the pandemic, when it seemed like Israel kind of had things under control, and New York in particular and Jewish communities here were really flailing. So Terry, tell us a little bit about that and how it has maybe shifted some of your understanding of these questions.
Excellent. So good evening, Jodi, or good afternoon, or good morning, and to everybody else here. And thank you to the BINA team and the Forward team for putting this event together. Seeing as this is under the sort of context of BINA and Forward, I think it's also nice to connect this also into a Jewish textual perspective. So I just like to refer perhaps to the opening of the Shema, one of the central Jewish texts, when it starts by saying, "Ve'afta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol mo'odecha." You should love God with all your heart and all your soul. And the question's always asked is, how can you command somebody to love somebody else? You can command them to eat this, to run here, to jump, but how can you command feeling? And the answer that's given, which links into what we're talking now, or one of the answers, which I like, is that instead of instead of it being actually you have to love, it's actually you're given a list of things that you must do. Okay, so you must teach your children, you must do mezuzah, tefillin, etc. Okay, and that links in with the idea of parents and children. Why? Because the more you do something for somebody else, the more you end up loving them. It's the reverse from what you think. A child loves a parent less than a parent loves a child, even though the parent gives the child everything. Okay? Now, if we take that concept and we look at the way that American Jewish relations have been with Israel over the last 70 years, it's been primarily a one-way street. It's been American Jews funding a project on the other side of the world, of which in many cases American Jews have gone to live there, and in many cases they haven't gone to live there, but that it's only gone, 99% of the money has gone in one direction. And I think that part of that has now led to a situation where American Jews feel sort of like they have more responsibility for Israel than the other way around. And what this corona crisis has created, for the first time that I've ever seen, certainly in my lifetime, is a sense that actually Israeli Jews are responsible also for American Jews. Now, Israeli Jews have been used to saying, yes, we're responsible for Jews in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in the former Soviet Union, in developing or emerging countries. It's the first time really ever where you see this sense of somehow things have worked out better in Israel than they have in the United States. How can we help our brothers and sisters on the other side of the pond? And I hope that in the same way as you give, it creates a sense of more ownership and responsibility. The same will happen in the American-Israeli relationship. Because when we discuss what community means, if it's always going to be, America gives to Israel money and Israel gives to America some form of Israeli identity on a birthright trip, it's going to reach a certain level and stop. I think what we're seeing now is actually a new model where both money and ideology will flow in both directions, because I think that American Jews realize that Israel is an integral part of passing on their Jewish identity to the next generation. And Israel is now realizing that American Jewry is an integral part of also bringing in Jewish identity into mainstream Israel. The amount of Israelis I hear that say they went to America as Israelis and came back as Jews is incredible. And I think that this is something which we need to leverage and take forward, because as different communities, we are always stronger when together. I can elaborate on that, but that's the guts of what I've taken from the corona crisis so far and the different communities.
Thank you, Terry. I want to pick up on something that Jodi, I think the last name was Cloper, posted a minute ago in the chat. Very simple message, same storm, different boats. I think it was when Ruth was talking about privilege. And I think as much as some of the questions we're talking about are universal, I do feel like we are in a moment that's at least unique in all of our lifetimes, in which the storm has really affected virtually everybody, and not in an insignificant way. I mean, our privileged middle and upper class lives, our work, whatever, are significantly disrupted. And many wealthy, famous people got this disease. So this is really a storm, and it's really affecting people. And I think one of the challenges it has presented and it's been global, has that kind of broken down walls and made people kind of more empathetic to each other's plights, or created more insularity. I mean, we have literal insularity, right, where travel restrictions are imposed and doors are cut off, but and more of a hierarchy of since that people are mostly worried about their own boat and can't look to the dinghy beyond. I'm struck by I remember the stories early on. There were stories about I forget who it was, but some very wealthy people who were posting to Instagram the pictures of themselves quarantining on their yachts, and they got quite a lot of crap for it, right? But this metaphor of same storm, different boats, it really, for me, it has been different in this pandemic than in anything I've ever lived through before. And the ability to balance, how do I deal with my own children's struggles with, you know, remote school versus the food pantry versus the people in a truly hard to hit neighborhood versus the people in the island in Colombia. So I wonder, I'll start with Nir because he's had the most time to think, but we can then just, everybody can comment on that question of how, you know, how this has challenged our Jewish notion of helping both, how this particular situation has challenged that.
So I agree with your framing that it gave us all an opportunity to maybe experience things that we are not used to experience. Like we use both here in Israel and in the States and in Europe to live in freedom. We can go wherever we want. We can read or say whatever we want. This is freedom, and for those of us who were born in those democratics, which is I think the most of us, this is something that we take as obvious. And I think one of the lessons that we got through this pandemic here in Israel, and I think in everywhere, is how privileged we are and how important it is to keep it that way. And those of you who see news from Israel in the last few weeks, see that there are many demonstrations on different issues, more than ever. Some will say because nobody can go abroad and travel during this August, so you have to go outside and do something. But I think it's more than that. I think people appreciate and understand how important it is for the local community, the local place, the city, the town, and the state. You cannot run away from it. And in those terms, we are all together. The second thing I will say about it is, you know, our strategy, our social changing strategy here in BINA for many years is to work in the local communities. And I think in the last 6 months here in Israel, it was we really could see the fruits of this long many years of work in local communities in Be'er Sheva, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa. That our volunteers, that they are young, most of them, and healthy, so they are not in a big risk, so they could go outside and volunteer. And they knew everyone in the community, and they knew the kids. It wasn't new for them, but the fact that it was local, that they live in the neighborhood, they can be in this radius that you can walk through the lockup. And they are really part of the neighborhoods and the community was very strongly, and we could be very effective. And this is something that I always appreciated in community work, in local community work, but today I even appreciate it more because this is something that you can do long term and to be part of something. And I think also to the things that Terry mentioned, that this is maybe something that we can find as Jews who are living today in the 21st century, and the majority of us are here in Israel, we call it chilonim, secular, in the States maybe unaffiliated or liberal or different names in different places, but all of us together looking for our Jewish destination. What is the next step? What we are doing? How do we fulfill our Judaism if we are not halachic Jews? And I think the mission and the destination of helping your community or local community do something good for the world, something that you in the American Jewry talking about for many years now, is something that we can do together and see it as a shared distance for us.
So I want to mention a couple things a couple different people have posted in the chat, I think on the same theme, which is that not so much the breakdown of helping Jews versus non-Jews or people close to you versus across the world, but thinking about like direct service versus systemic change, right? And I think the answer is probably it's great to do both, but how do you grapple with that question of like literally getting eggs to the people on the island versus I think somebody mentioned fighting for universal health care, or, you know, more systemic change that you would put in a more, that's more about indirect political change. Ruth, you want to grab that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid, Jodi, from my answer to both of all of these questions is both and.
Yeah.
And in this case, both and supported by text. To take care of the other and the stranger is to do what you're doing, for sure covers what you're doing with the food pantry, certainly covers Daniel's dramatic egg story, which I think we'll all remember for quite some time, so thank you. But in order to do service in the way in which I think Judaism would have us do it, requires that we ask why. Like, why don't those people have eggs? Why is healthcare so disparate for people in our own country and our own community? You know, so if you ask why, then you discover that there are upstream or root causes for why things are the way they are. And I want to say very clearly, at least in America, you discover that particular people are profiting from the inequities that are being promoted. So you can't challenge, there's no food pantry that can feed everybody. There's no COVID response. Of course you respond to COVID right now, as you said, first of all, with the anxieties in your own home and your own family and your own disruption. But then you start asking some of the bigger questions. You start looking for those root causes. And if you are taking Torah teaching seriously, then taking care of the other and the stranger has to be paired with pursuing justice. And food pantries feed people, but they don't pursue justice in the food distribution system. That requires what I describe as straightforward advocacy. I also want to answer your other question, and I wish I knew the answer to, you asked, like, does the fact that we're all in the same boat or in the same storm, different boats, how does that affect people? So I think, you know, it is a shock perhaps and a kind of wake-up call that when it's a pandemic, it doesn't know national borders, it doesn't know faith borders, and it doesn't know class borders. But it does affect different people differently. I'm sheltered in place in a way, thank God, with 5 adults in my family and 1 wonderful little baby. And we spend a lot of time in that. We don't have the problem of school-age children running around the house, and which is a huge problem for most of my colleagues. We spent a lot of time figuring out where we were going to order our food from and who was going to do the ordering. But I said every 2 days, these are problems of privilege. And I know, I live in Manhattan, I know that in Queens, the state senator opens her office with emergency food, just what you were talking about, I think twice a week, and the line of people is 6 blocks long. I know that the people that I bang a pot for at 7 o'clock at night because they're essential health workers, many of those people are undocumented immigrants. So they are getting none of the meager help that our government is giving out. They're not getting, and they're nevertheless trying to hold their families together. So I have to look at the justice issues as well as the service issues and balance both of them.
I love that, Ruth. Thank you. I mean, I really do. It's funny for me, you know, I spent my life as a journalist, and so that gave me a passport into all kinds of other communities. And then even since I've become an editor and spent more time in my office, especially when I was working in New York City, the experience of commuting is around New York City is an experience of kind of really being neck to neck with different kinds of people. And for me, that has been the hardest thing about the pandemic, has been that kind of separation between the other people's experiences that I felt more exposed to. But I do feel like because we are all going through something, there is that way to remind yourself every time you think, oh, what a pain to do this or that, you know, whatever it is you have to do, to understand how much more difficult it is for some other people. I want to pick up on what Ruth was talking about, the why, and turn to both Daniel and Terry, and we'll let Terry go first this time. Both of you are personally philanthropic. You know, you've been successful in your businesses and are devoting, you know, investing your money in good works. And I want to ask you really directly how you deal with Ruth's why and decide kind of at what level to act and to engage. I I assume some of it is gut and some of it is more intellectual.
Let's unmute myself. Ruth has put the dilemma, very clearly and well focused. I should say this, we build one of our companies builds mobile hospitals, and in Peru we've supplied 10 mobile hospitals that are on the front line fighting corona, and we're dealing with tens of thousands of people, moving hospitals, every 2 to 3 days. We're moving them all around the country, and we're seeing what's happening. We're seeing how people are being affected, our own staff as well. It is a real challenge. It's not easy, but I think there are a couple of assumptions which are being thrown out, which people say them 100 times so people believe them, and I don't think that they're true. So I just want to challenge some of these sort of accepted facts, which I don't think are accepted. Number one, they are definitely not accepting all people. Corona is not a leveler. It's not affecting all people the same. People who have come from top class medical environments have huge advantages over people in horrendously poor countries. I'm just even on the basic issues of whether you've got ventilation machines, etc. or not. This is not a leveler. If anything, this is an example of where people who have advantages are going to survive far. The probability of them surviving is far greater. Number one. Number two, there's this concept that democracy is somehow helpful. In actual fact, it's not clear. It might be that democracy is helpful, but certainly looking at some of the figures, the more democratic you are and the more you put personal freedom above listening to what your prime minister or president is saying to you, actually might be a negative. It might be one of those very strange cases, in the same way that we know that community increases people's happiness in life and adds extra years to their life expectancy. This is one of those few rare cases where actually communal life is horrendous and terrible, which is why you see Jewish communities, whether in New York or London or other major areas, being hit far harder than other parts of the population. So first of all, I just want to challenge those things and make sure that people aren't just accepting things. That's number one. Number two, how to deal with the balance. I think I was always taught there's what you see and there's what you smell. These things you have to go with your nose. There's no this is right and this is wrong. It's in your kishkas. You go with what your nose tells you to do, and you find a balance which you're somehow happy with. Sometimes it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Sometimes it's 9 and 3. Sometimes it's 10 and 2. But that's the way you answer. That's the way you go with it. But going back to the first thing, it's so important to keep your eyes, ears, and brain open and analyze what's really being said rather than just taking in what's being said.
Daniel, can you tell us a little bit about your own, I love it's not what you see, it's what you smell. I think we've got a couple of great takeaway lines from here. Storms and boats, some seas and smells. I would love, Daniel, for you to talk a little, if you can, personally about, you are clearly doing so much good in the world and you have this opportunity and you've chosen to do good in the world. And I wonder how you make the specific decisions about how you will invest that money.
Well, I think just to refer to what Terry said, if he was referring to the great equalizer, what I mentioned, I was less talking about the medical, which even in poor countries where I visit, very few people die. And let's not get into the statistics. But what I was referring to is people being scared and people losing their economic ability to survive. And that's where, even though people with privilege, people have issues like I do, and I'm sure you do, and they're manageable. But I was less referring to the medical side and more that people all have problems, and it became in a way like a community where everybody could share the fact that we all had issues. And those who could help are those who generally had more abilities or were more privileged. I mean, I would say that, for me, and I've always been involved, I would say, foundation's 20 odd years old, but always been involved in social affairs in the countries I live with. But I don't think I've had the clarity that I've had in the last 5 months. And I cannot tell you where it comes from. It's natural for me because you can either do a lot of very little, or you can do a little of something that's penetrating and deep. And I don't think everybody wants to do everything for everybody. And we know, I think Terry said it, and even Ruth, you can't. And the more you do think in that way, the less you'll do, in fact. And I think you end up being frustrated. So it's much better in this pandemic, for sure, to try to concentrate on your neighborhood and do things deeply. And what I've realized, and in a way it's like human triage. I hate to boil it down to that, but you need to look at where you can do the most, where the bleeders are, if you want to use it in medical terms. And it's very easy for us to see where that is and where we can help. The offshoot of what we're doing, which is amazing, is when people know that they're being helped. And I think Terry said it that very nicely, that you help people and you realize, I think Terry, you said that you actually love those people more than the other way around. Was that what you said? Something like that, which is really quite amazing because it's very true. But what happens when you help people in this moment is that it gives rise to everything else. We're now working in the schools in this village because there's no school for 1 year. It's been from March until January, there will be no school. So that led to a distant learning with telephones because nobody has computers. And we made a deal with a telephone company. Health visits. Wouldn't have thought of it because there's so many other things. So I think the food issue, for me at least, has been that this has calmed people's nerves to a point where you could say, now that we know that everybody knows where their next meal was coming from, everything else was possible. And I found that enormously satisfying, not to me per se, but enormously satisfying to those that we're working for, which are the 17, 18,000 people. The other thing I would say is, while I'm a staunch secular Jew and proud of it, but very proud of my culture, and as Yael, who's here, will know, that's all we do in Israel, is get people to understand that culture is what it's all about. And within the culture, you have many Judaisms with an S, that I started looking at things I never imagined doing, which is some of them are Mizrahi sages. And why? I'm Germanic as they come. I'm more Yekka than the word imagines you to believe. And I suddenly realized that all the compassion, I shouldn't say all, but so much of it has come from women and men, sages that were, women from Yemen, others. If you've not studied it, I suggest it. I'll tell you just 2 lines and then I'll stop talking. One was from a Lebanese-born rabbi who was born in the late 1800s. And his learning from the Talmud was that this love by the Hebrews, he said, for mankind was the key cause for kindling feelings of mercy, compassion, and forgiveness for anyone who's been struck and hurt by evil. That's Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Mizrahi. And then one more, which is maybe closer to people like Ruth and others, Rabbi David de Solapul, who was the head of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, who died in 1970. And he wrote things like, he talked about the gathering from all 4 corners of the earth and from the dust of the ground that was created, that came from Genesis. So no one country can claim to be the land of the first man. And he goes on to talk about how you should be helping your fellow human being, your fellow mammalian, if you will. And just as a funny aside, David de Solapul had a secretary in the 50s, and her name was Margaret Posen, none other than my aunt, my father's sister, who was the Yekka of Yekkas of New York, a woman working for a Mizrahi rabbi at the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. How do you like that one? So I do believe, just to end, Jodi, that what is, I know people will argue what is and what isn't innate in us, but I am firmly of the belief that most of what we're talking about is innate in us. We need to find reasons, we need to find moral values in teaching from whether it's Buddha or whether it's Confucius or anybody you choose. But I do believe that the best in us does come out, and we have seen ugly things, but we are in a world of 7 billion people. You're not going to get it all right, and you're going to see the ugly too. But I think the glass is much more half full than half empty.
Thank
Jodi?
you, Daniel. I'm gonna, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna do a quick lightning round of the panel on the following question. I'm gonna ask each of you to just share with us an anecdote, something you've seen personally, read about, heard about, that inspired you in terms of what's happening in the pandemic in the realm of social justice. Maybe, I guess, ideally outside your specific organization or personal work, but something that you saw or know about that you can share. Before that, I'll just do a little bit more talkless. First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your really insightful questions and comments. And thank you to BINA for organizing this, to Yafit and Reut, and on the forward team to Dina Cooperman and Lisa Lepson. I believe you will all be getting an email following up with this that will have the recording. We would love it if you'll share it with your friends. And along with that, you'll also be receiving a special discount to offer for subscribing to the Forward, and a way to make sure you get our free email newsletters to keep up with our journalism and be told of our future events. So I think that's all the specifics, logistics. I wish everybody a reflective and meaningful Elul and high holidays. And let's do, as I said, a lightning round. We'll let's give Nir, as our sort of official host, the last word. So I don't know, Ruth, are you with us?
Yes.
Ruth, you want to start with a point of light that you've experienced in the last couple months, and just keep it brief?
Right. I'm just very quick. I want to say two things very quickly. The point of light is that I would share, because people aren't aware of it, is in all of these other countries where COVID is manifesting itself, where the problems are getting worse and worse, and where organizations are stepping forward not only to take care of the immediate people who are sick, but to do the advocacy that we talked about before, to start fighting with their governments for fairer treatment, to not let bans on social mixing make it impossible for people to get to market. COVID in the developing world is going to have worse and worse ramifications in terms of the spread of hunger, not just the virus. So I want to make that point. But Jodi, I want to make one other point before we close, because I've been looking at the chat, and many people in the chat come from what I would call an either-or mentality. And I want to go back to the text that Nir used to say it's not either or. So it's not only help poor Jews and therefore you can't help anybody else. It's not only help people in the developing world so you can't help your neighbor. And it's not only do service so you can't do advocacy. It's a question individually and then in your congregation, in your community, for how can I divide up my time, my charitable dollars, and my energies to be both and.
Thank you, Ruth. Terry, you want to do it next? Can you share a quick...
yeah, sure, fine. So, there are so many incredible examples of people doing marvelous things. Some of them we've heard here. You know, when I'm dealing with health workers who are literally putting their life on their lives, going into you know, centres, whether it's doing service and maintenance or moving things, knowing the way that these diseases work, I am just filled with wow, you people are incredible. There is a specific idea that I'd just like to share and perhaps leave with this. One of the things that I have, you kind of, everyone knows in the back of their head, but you don't quite appreciate it until now, is how the entire economic system creates dependence one on the other. And there's so many things that we do without realizing how much they affect others. And there's a lovely phrase that's being used in the UK at the moment, which is eat out to help out. Now, I don't remember, you know, ever sort of thinking, wow, I'm going to go to a restaurant because I'm going to help the person who owns the restaurant, who's going to employ the waiters and the cleaners and the suppliers. But all of a sudden, it puts into perspective how the entire sort of chain works and how you're a cog, and we're all little cogs and we're all linked. And I think that if that, you know, comes out and forward, and the fact that in that respect, we're also all part of a local community with our local restaurants, but all, you know, global supply chains are global. One of the incredible things, by the way, is that despite all of COVID, there have been no food shortages because of supply chain issues in the entire world. There's still food shortages because of poverty and issues, but, you know, that whole system has worked. So this entire global chain works, local community, eat out to help out, with everything that that means.
Thanks, Terry. Daniel, I know you maybe thought you were signing up before, but you want to add one more point, and then we'll go to Nir?
Yeah, by the way, I understood that we're going to 15 minutes past. Is that incorrect? Just so I can keep, it said it on the show. I don't know whether Nir said 7:15, but never mind. I think mine would be, first of all, what Terry and Ruth said, one cannot say anything but yes, yes, and yes. I think the thing that sticks in my head, there are many things, but just pulling one out actually is a BINA experience in South Tel Aviv, where I once visited the South. I don't know if they're Sudanese refugees, and they speak Hebrew, and there's a leadership group. I'm not exactly sure what the name is, and I think we're supporting somewhere indirectly. But one of the things I thought about when I talked to the lead guy there, with one of these dreadful stories, I mean, families ripped apart. I mean, the worst of the worst stories. And here's this kind, compassionate guy speaking in Hebrew, speaks French, speaks English, Nir speaking to him, and I think Iran as an equal, which is exactly how it should be. But what I want to say about that is continuity in this moment is so important, whatever it is. And I think there's such upheaval, and people are being pulled from their roots and having to do other things. But there's a level of continuity which is very calming. And I think to know that BINA, for instance, has said, yes, we have a world full of problems, but we try to keep the keel as it was before to show that things do continue. There is a life after. This is not ending our world. I mean, people need to show that institutions are continuing. And I think that was a very important thing for me to see. And we've mimicked that in our own foundation by ensuring that what we're doing, we're not only doing the same, we're going to do more, just to show that this is not breaking us, and it's going to do the opposite effect, especially in education.
Great. Nir, can you close us out?
Sure. So I thought about, I have so many examples to share, but I thought about one maybe more personal. So during this lockup period, I had a small car accident, collision. I'm okay, but the car went total loss. And there were 5 people involved in it, and this was in the on the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And I thought to myself in the first moment, how many people are going to stop to help us? Because, the social distance, mask, and all those things. And many people stopped, as is usual. You couldn't feel the disease in the air. So I thought about it then, that it is something that about being a human being. That with all your fears and with all the restrictions, when you see people in those kinds of situations, you stop and you help. And there were many of them that wanted to help. We just had to say everything is okay, you can keep going. But that for me was something that I'm keeping in my heart, that you can, there's a very, very famous Hebrew song, you have to believe in the human being, in Hebrew. So I still believe in the people, in the human beings. And I will thank you all for participating and being with us in the panel. Of course, for all of you that are participating, and we had more than 100 in the Zoom, and I don't know how many in Facebook Live, maybe later you will tell me. And of course, to the panelists, that Terry and Daniel and Ruth, you are all big supporters and friends and inspiration for us here in Tel Aviv and in Israel. And like always, it was very interesting to listen to you, and of course to you, Jodi, for leading us through this panel, and to all the people who made it happen. Ruth, I have a live audience here in Tel Aviv, so it's nice. So Ruth, which is here, and Yafit, and Yael, the Posen Foundation in Israel. So thank you very much. And good day, wherever you are. Good night. Here.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you very much to everybody. Jodi, thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. Thank you, BINA.